Welcome, deep divers, to a journey that might just flip your understanding of addiction treatment on its head. Imagine for a moment stepping back into a time before Alcoholics Anonymous was widely known, before the 12 steps became such a cultural touchstone. What if the main way people thought about helping those, well, caught in the grip of alcohol wasn't about spiritual surrender at all? What if it was rooted in this really demanding, almost academic approach to self-mastery? What did that even look like, and how did this sort of forgotten chapter shape everything that followed?
It's a really fascinating period. You could call it a kind of Wild West era for understanding addiction, really. The whole idea of alcoholism is something you could treat rather than just, a moral failing or a weakness of character. That was only just starting to come together. The approaches back then were incredibly varied, often kind of piecemeal, and they frequently lacked any systematic method, not like we think of today, which makes studying what did exist, like Peabody's work, all more critical, I think.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to take a real deep dive into this crucial historical moment. Specifically, we want to shine a light on Richard Peabody's influential 1931 book, The Common Sense of Drinking. Now, this wasn't just another book arguing for temperance or something. It was truly groundbreaking for its time. A pre-AA attempt at a structured psychological re-education approach to treating alcoholism. By really getting into Peabody's insights in the world he was working in, you'll gain, I think, a profound appreciation for just how radical, how revolutionary AA's later spiritual solution truly was. You'll discover these sophisticated, self-reliant methods that came before AA, and how, in its own way, Peabody's work kind of inadvertently paved the way for a completely different kind of recovery.
Yeah, and to do that, we've meticulously pulled our insights directly from excerpts of The Common Sense of Drinking itself. We've also looked at key historical texts on Alcoholics Anonymous, its history, its foundational principles, and importantly, the personal stories of its early members. It's a rich, complex picture, a tapestry of thought from a really pivotal era in how we understand addiction.
Okay, so we've glimpsed that sort of chaotic backdrop around addiction in the early 20th century. Now let's turn to Richard Peabody. Here's a figure who really dared to impose some structure on all that disarray. Can you set the scene for us? Imagine the intellectual landscape, say, early 1930s America. Prohibition was still technically law, though maybe on its last legs.
Right, its end was looming, definitely. But the understanding of alcoholism as anything other than a moral failing, a weakness, a sin, just bad behavior that was incredibly basic, really nascent. There weren't established medical protocols for chronic alcoholism as we know them, no widespread psychological therapies, certainly no organized support groups like AA. It was, like you said before, largely uncharted territory, and it was just rife with judgment and, frankly, despair for those suffering.
So in that climate where the solutions were often just punishment jail, institutions being ostracized.
Exactly. In that environment, Richard Peabody really did emerge as a pioneer. His book, The Common Sense of Drinking, published in 1931, was significant precisely because it dared to offer a systematic psychological method. He wasn't talking about spiritual confession or group therapy, no. He was offering a highly structured, almost academic path to individual self-control and mental reconstruction. And this was at a time when most people, even many medical professionals, saw alcoholism primarily through that really unforgiving lens of moral failure.
Just lacking willpower.
Right. Society basically thought an alcoholic was someone who simply chose to drink too much, lacked discipline, rather than someone suffering from a complex condition. Peabody's work, just by suggesting a method for recovery, implicitly challenged that simplistic view.
And central to his view was this incredibly detailed description of what he called the vicious circle of the alcoholic cycle. Well, he paints a really vivid, almost suffocating picture of the progression, doesn't he? Starting with that seemingly harmless first drink that quickly sets the person off again. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it's quite powerful. Peabody observed that for someone caught in this cycle, the morning after isn't just a mild hangover. It's a descent into acute nervous depression, real anxiety. So instead of facing the nervousness and depression of a morning after soberly, the alcoholic feels this overwhelming need to be heavily braced just to start the day. And that usually means another drink or maybe several. It's not about pleasure at this point, you see. It's a desperate, almost reflexive act to avoid immediate, profound suffering.
The crushing anxiety, the shakes, the self-loathing.
Exactly. All of that hits hard right after the previous night's excess.
Oh.
Self-medication, really. A desperate attempt to fend off the pain that the alcohol itself caused.
Right, a truly vicious cycle.
And it continues through the day. Peabody describes it like this. At lunchtime, he imbibes again to avoid the hardships of the afternoon. At 5 o'clock, he can hardly wait to shake up his cocktails, and by late evening, he is drunk again. This isn't social drinking. This is someone completely enslaved by it. This constant daily drinking leads to regular drunkenness, which is then followed, maybe out of sheer exhaustion or necessity, by these periods of drying out, temporary abstinence, often pretty short-lived.
And you'd think that drying out phase would offer some relief, some kind of reset.
Yeah.
But from Peabody's description, it sounds like anything but.
You're hitting on the real tragedy here, the brutality of it. The insidious part, as Peabody points out, is that even during these brief sober spells, the mind gets no rest when sober. It's just relentlessly tormented. Tormented by the memory of the drinking, the acute nervous hangover, the deep remorse, these overwhelming feelings of inferiority and failure, this internal anguish, the guilt, the self-reproach. It becomes so intense, so unbearable that the person is driven right back to drinking.
Just to shut it off for a while.
Exactly. They crave any temporary escape, any brief numbing to silence those tormenting thoughts. And boom, the whole debilitating process starts again. Drunkenness, acute nervous hangover, remorse, feelings of inferiority, then drunkenness again. Peabody notes the sober intervals get shorter and shorter, preventing the nervous system from any chance of recuperating. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating trap where the supposed cure, the drink, only deepens the illness.
That sounds utterly suffocating, like a psychological prison the mind builds for itself. He also talked about some people having a predisposition, didn't he? And about certain danger signals emerging. So it wasn't just random luck.
No, not in his view. He definitely noted that some individuals seem predisposed to a morbid state of mind in sobriety, meaning they carry some underlying emotional or psychological vulnerability, maybe a kind of internal disquiet or instability that alcohol then just dramatically worsens. For these people, alcohol isn't just a casual thing. It acts as a danger signal, revealing and amplifying these deeper issues. He gave some really compelling, almost chilling examples of how character transforms under alcohol's influence. Someone who might usually be an amiable, maybe even charming drunk could suddenly and repeatedly become rude, obscene, and sometimes actively hostile.
Wow. Not just a bad night, but a fundamental shift.
A fundamental shift in personality, exactly. Or think about someone who initially prided themselves on bouncing back quickly, heavy night but sharp at the office the next morning. Peabody observed that this same person could eventually slide into being a continuous drinker. They lose that quick recovery ability, they're perpetually under the influence, but crucially, they retain all their disagreeable traits from when they're drunk, sometimes even magnified. These aren't just hangovers anymore. These are huge red flags waving frantically. They show that alcohol isn't just a casual indulgence for this person, it's fundamentally altering their character, their relationships, their entire life. It's leading them down a path of increasing isolation and self-destruction.
Okay, so given this really stark understanding of the vicious circle, how did Peabody propose to break it? This is where it gets really interesting. The core of his solution, he called it re-education, and it was all about self-mastery, a rigorous intellectual approach. He famously advised patients to view recovery not as some fleeting effort, but like a course, say, in medicine or technology. That's a really powerful and pretty unique analogy for treating addiction back in the 1930s.
It truly is, and it speaks volumes about his core philosophy. The individual, through sheer intellectual rigor and conscious effort, could overcome this. He's basically saying, look, this isn't casual, it's not a magical fix. It demands the same level of hard work, dedication, and sustained effort you'd put into studying for years to become a doctor or an engineer. Just because there aren't formal lectures or exams doesn't make this course any less important. On the contrary, he explicitly states it's the most important problem with which he has ever been faced. The implication is crystal clear. You are the student, the subject, the curriculum, and ultimately the architect of your own recovery, all through the power of your own mind. It's a demanding, solitary, intellectual battle he's describing.
So fundamentally, it's about intellectual control and meticulous planning, taking absolute charge of your own mind, your impulses.
Precisely. The ultimate goal for Peabody is to increase intellectual control, to get individuals accustomed to plan their lives and direct their energies by themselves. This is an explicit focus on developing a strong feeling of personality and responsibility. He even saw that alcoholics often possess a strong will, stubbornness. And his method aimed to consciously redirect that very stubbornness from destructive to constructive ends. So instead of rigidly clinging to the bottle, you'd rigidly cling to your sobriety plan. It's about seizing the reins of your own mental processes, creating new, healthy habits of thought and action through sheer force of intellect and will.
And he even had a specific technique for this, almost like a kind of internal dialogue or self-talk, highlighting his deep belief in the power of thought. How did he see that working practically?
Oh, he had immense faith in it. Peabody asserted, thought is powerful, words are powerful, if combined with appropriate action. He encouraged alcoholics to internalize a specific kind of rational, logical self-talk, almost like a personal mantra you'd repeat. They'd tell themselves, for example, the most sensible part of me does not want to drink anymore because much experimentation has proved it to be a most unsatisfactory way of living. It's like making a scientific, evidence-based argument with yourself. He believed that through this scientific manner how to rid myself of the habit, carefully analyzing your destructive patterns and replacing them with these rational, self-affirming thoughts, you would eventually become very much happier. And what's really striking is how he presents this happiness from a purely selfish point of view, distinct from any effects on others. It reinforces the deeply individualistic, self-reliant nature of his whole method. It's about personal, logical triumph, not necessarily fixing relationships or anything external.
Right. So even his concept of surrender would be very different from how we think about it in recovery today, wouldn't it? It's not about giving up entirely or giving up to something bigger than yourself.
You're absolutely right. It's quite distinct. For Peabody, surrender wasn't about immediately stopping drinking or admitting total defeat to some overwhelming power. Instead, it meant a willingness to be shown how to reconstruct his mental processes so that in due time he will no longer want to drink. Huh. So you're surrendering to the process of re-education itself. You're surrendering to your own more intelligent self rather than to an external spiritual entity or a higher power. It's an active, conscious engagement with a program of mental restructuring, a logical acceptance of the need for self-improvement, not an emotional or spiritual capitulation. The power still lies within the individual, but it's a disciplined submission to their own rational mind.
Okay. He also looked into what triggers drinking, right? Identifying common emotional tensions, fear, worry, boredom. And he saw alcohol as this incredibly tempting narcotic that for a short time just wipes that tension away. Sounds like a constant trap.
That's a really crucial insight from Peabody, and one that still resonates today, absolutely. He understood that alcohol for a short while removes tension most effectively. This immediate, powerful, though temporary relief makes it an incredibly tempting narcotic for people prone to fear, chronic worry, or deep boredom. The alcoholic learns this quick fix mechanism, reinforcing the cycle over and over. So his cure aimed to prevent this insidious buildup of tension in the first place, teaching individuals how to face life calmly and quietly without needing alcohol as a sedative or an emotional escape hatch. It was about building internal resilience against those triggers.
And then there's this critical pitfall he identifies for people trying to recover, the danger of forgetting.
Yeah.
It sounds like it taps into that cunning, baffling nature of addiction itself.
This is maybe one of his most insightful observations, yeah. It really gets at the deceptive psychology of relapse. Peabody warned that if alcohol is forgotten too soon, if someone gets too absorbed in new interests, a new job, a period of feeling stable, it can creep back into consciousness. Not as a life-threatening danger, but as such a negligible factor that one or two drinks cannot make any difference. That seemingly innocent thought, that false sense of control, that's the trap. The mind, freed from the acute suffering, convinces itself the problem is gone, that they're cured. But Peabody's warning is stark. When a drunkard resumes drinking, it is never very long before alcohol again rules supreme. The mind has to stay eternally vigilant, constantly aware of the true nature of the problem, even when life seems normal again. The beast is just sleeping, essentially.
Wow. Okay, so that's Peabody's landscape, this meticulously structured, intensely self-reliant process of re-education, a program for intellectual and behavioral self-mastery. It's a compelling vision, no doubt. But as we know, history rarely follows just one path. Only a few short years after Peabody's book challenged the status quo, a completely different, even revolutionary current started to emerge, one that would offer an alternative vision, one that would become known as Alcoholics Anonymous.
Indeed. We jump forward just a bit to 1935. Alcoholics Anonymous is founded by Bill W., a New York stockbroker, and Dr. Bob, an Akron surgeon, both severe alcoholics themselves in Akron, Ohio. It was really born out of desperation and a shared spiritual experience they had. This tiny fledgling group started to gain some traction. By 1937, they'd eventually separated from their origins in the Oxford Group, which was an evangelical Christian movement active then. They even managed to secure some initial, though limited, funding from John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1938. That was a crucial moment, actually, because he famously refused to give more money, which inadvertently saved AA from becoming professionalized and potentially losing its peer-led grassroots feel. And it was right around then, 1938, that they also began writing their foundational text, Alcoholics Anonymous, which everyone now knows as the Big Book.
Now, the Oxford group you mentioned was influential early on, especially for Bill W. and Dr. Bob, but it also had significant limitations, right? Especially for the kind of severe alcoholics they were trying to reach. What made it kind of a difficult fit?
While the Oxford group was quite popular in the 1930s, it certainly shared a very fervent spiritual approach. They emphasized what they called pietist insight, this deep, personal, religious experience focused on moral regeneration and aggressive evangelism, a drive to openly confess sins and convert others. This definitely appealed initially to Bill W. and Dr. Bob. However, the Oxford group's focus was primarily on community leaders, the elite, people who were already pretty stable and respectable, but maybe felt they needed some moral rejuvenation. As one early AA member put it rather bluntly, they didn't want the peons. Meaning they weren't really geared towards the down-and-out chronic drunkard, the person truly at rock bottom. This often led to judgmental attitudes towards those who didn't fit their mold or who kept slipping. Dr. Bob, for example, despite his deep interest in religious philosophy, his extensive reading of scripture and lives of saints kept getting drunk regularly while he was attending Oxford group meetings. His ideas for reform, ironically, seemed to come only when he was well lubricated with alcohol, and invariably he forgot them by the next day. It really highlights the group's practical ineffectiveness for severe, physically addicted alcoholics. It was an intellectual and moral framework that just didn't penetrate the physical craving and mental obsession.
That's such a stark contrast to Peabody, who focused everything on self-mastery, almost intellectual willpower. But here, with AA's origins, we see this crucial insight emerging that completely flips the script. The idea that willpower for the alcoholic isn't just insufficient, it might actually be part of the problem. And Dr. Silkworth, Bill W.'s physician, played a huge role in this, didn't he?
Dr. Silkworth's advice was, in many ways, the turning point for Bill W. He implicitly guided Bill away from the Oxford group's more preachy, evangelistic style, which clearly wasn't working for alcoholics like him and Dr. Bob. Silkworth, drawing on his deep understanding of alcoholism as a medical disease, an allergy of the body, an obsession of the mind, advised Bill against sermonizing or trying to convert alcoholics through force of argument. He pointed out the frightening aspect of the Oxford group's absolutes, their rigid moral demands, and the weirdness, as he put it, of those sudden, dramatic spiritual breakthroughs they aimed for, the hot flash conversion experiences. For a desperate, suffering alcoholic, those often felt alienating, completely unobtainable. So instead, Silkworth implicitly nudged Bill towards a more relatable, experiential approach, focusing on commonality, shared suffering, mutual understanding, one alcoholic talking to another rather than religious dogma or intellectual debate. It was less about telling them what they should do and more about sharing what had actually worked.
And this really led to that explicit, fundamental rejection of willpower, which is a complete departure from Peabody's entire philosophy of self-mastery.
It is the absolute core distinction, yes. Where Peabody championed intellectual control and self-mastery, believing the individual's rational mind could be retrained, AA explicitly states right in their literature that alcoholics can't get sober by our willpower. We've failed again and again. This isn't just a suggestion, it's a foundational truth observed empirically by the founding members. The experience of countless alcoholics, including Bill W. and Dr. Bob, prove that personal resolve alone was utterly insufficient to break the addiction cycle. In fact, relying on sheer willpower often led to repeated failure, which then just fostered deeper feelings of guilt, shame, and inferiority, locking the alcoholic even tighter into that vicious cycle Peabody described. It's the realization that the will itself is compromised, that the mind, once it crosses a certain line with alcohol, cannot reliably fix itself.
And the view of alcohol itself also shifted dramatically, didn't it? From Peabody, seeing it as a kind of narcotic to manage tension, AA identified it as an outright enemy, something deeply corrosive to the self.
Yes. While Peabody certainly acknowledged alcohol's damaging effects and its temporary tension-relieving properties, AA goes much, much further. It recognizes liquor not as a flawed coping mechanism, but as an active enemy. An enemy that profoundly corrodes self-esteem, destroys relationships, and fuels overwhelming self-pity. This leads to what they describe vividly as years of suicidal thinking, years of self-loathing. Alcohol isn't just a temporary escape in this view, it's an insidious force that actively dismantles an individual's sense of self, their purpose. It fosters a twisted system of beliefs brought on by trauma and shame that becomes, as they put it, an unconscious program for living. This enemy isn't something you manage through re-education. It's something that utterly defeats the individual will. Therefore, it has to be overcome through a fundamental internal change, a complete overhaul of one's inner world, aided by something stronger than oneself.
So if willpower isn't the answer, and alcohol is seen as this relentless enemy that has already defeated the self, what's left? That's where AA introduced its simple kit of spiritual tools, marking this really significant paradigm-shifting move away from purely psychological re-education to a spiritually based program.
Indeed. It's a pragmatic response, born from the observed, repeated failure of every other method they'd tried. Since individual will and intellectual effort had proven insufficient for the real alcoholic, as they termed it, AA offered this alternative centered on a simple kit of spiritual tools. This was a radical innovation, moving from a self-reliant intellectual battle, like Peabody proposed, to a program rooted in spiritual transformation. This shift acknowledged a dimension beyond just human effort and intellect. It suggested the problem was deeper than just behavior or faulty thinking, and the solution required a different kind of power altogether.
Okay, let's dig into these spiritual tools, starting with what has to be one of the most foundational principles, the power greater than ourselves, especially as it's put in step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Mhm.
Now, for many newcomers, especially those who might be atheist, agnostic, or just, burned out on religion, this must present an immediate, almost insurmountable hurdle.
It absolutely does. And the AA literature acknowledges this directly, very empathetically. It states quite clearly, some of us won't believe in God, others can't, and still others who do believe that God exists have no faith whatever he will perform this miracle. So the initial resistance, the disbelief, the skepticism, it's not just expected, it's understood as part of the process for many. But AA's genius, I think, lies in its profound flexibility and inclusivity on this point. It's explicitly not about adhering to a rigid, dogmatic definition of God. It doesn't demand any specific theological belief. Instead, it simply invites the individual to embrace a spirituality open to a new kinship with God, defining their power in a way that is deeply personal and can evolve over time.
That's where the concept of a God of my understanding comes in, right? It makes it incredibly personal, adaptable. It broadens the appeal way beyond traditional religious structures.
Precisely. This concept of a power greater than ourselves is intensely personal. For some, sure, it might be a traditional idea of God they grew up with or perhaps rediscovered. But for countless others, especially early on, that power can simply be the fellowship of AA and the people in it. The collective strength, the wisdom, the shared experience of the group itself can be that power. Just the understanding that these people are real, compassionate, and understanding, and they've achieved sobriety, something I haven't, that can be the initial spark of belief in something working. For others, it might be nature, the universe, abstract principles like love or truth, or simply the inexplicable force of recovery they witness in others who were just as hopeless as they feel. This radical inclusivity is key. It helps bridge the gap for anyone who might otherwise be put off by traditional religious language, making the spiritual aspect truly accessible.
And this openness, this recognition of a multitude of ways to connect with a higher power, actually has deep roots. It connects back to the work of William James, the American psychologist and philosopher. This wasn't just made up whole cloth by AA.
That's a really crucial connection, yes. And it provided a profound intellectual foundation for AA's spiritual but not religious approach. William James's seminal work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, had a huge influence on Bill W. And through him, on the whole philosophy of AA, James meticulously documented a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God, showing that spiritual experience is diverse, personal, and definitely not confined to any single doctrine or church. This academic validation helped AA position itself apart from the rigid, often dogmatic religious structures of the time. It allowed them to focus on the experience of spiritual transformation, whatever its specific theological interpretation or lack thereof. As AA clearly states, we have no desire to convince anyone that there is only one way by which faith can be acquired. This open-mindedness allowed AA to offer a spiritual solution without demanding religious conformity, making it truly revolutionary for its time.
So this leads directly into the transformative power of surrender and humility, which are so central to the AA experience. William James even describes surrender as a spiritual birthday. That's a pretty profound way to put it.
It is, isn't it? A remarkably evocative description. It really captures the depth of this internal shift. James talks about a state where the constant, exhausting will to assert the self, the ego's stubborn insistence on being in control, is finally, quote, displaced by a willingness to close our mouths and be as nothing in the floods and waterspouts of God. Now, this isn't about weakness. It's a conscious, active letting go of self-will. Not as an act of defeat, but as a necessary step towards accessing a deeper, more profound kind of strength and connection. This moment, this profound surrender, is described by James as a moral death, turned into our spiritual birthday. It's like shedding the old, unworkable self to be reborn into something new, something functional, something connected.
And humility, then, in this context, isn't about beating yourself up or feeling worthless, is it? It sounds like something much more constructive.
Not at all. Self-abasement is the goal. Humility in AA is defined much more positively as a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by a sincere attempt to become what we could be. This involves doing an honest, unflinching inventory of one's character defects and shortcomings, like they do in steps 4 and 5. But the point isn't to dwell in shame, it's to identify specific areas for growth and transformation. It's about grounded self-awareness, a realistic appraisal of both your limitations and your potential, which allows for genuine progress. Furthermore, AA teaches that a full and thankful heart cannot entertain great conceits, meaning cultivating an attitude of gratitude is seen as the basic ingredient of humility. By focusing on gratitude, you naturally develop a more humble, open, and less self-centered perspective on life.
And accepting powerlessness over alcohol, right back in step 1, is a crucial part of this humility. It really sets the stage for everything else that follows.
Indeed. It's the absolute bedrock of step 1 and a recurring theme throughout the whole program. Recognizing that you cannot control the addiction alone, that your individual willpower has utterly failed, that's the necessary starting point for genuine recovery in the AA model. It's about letting go of that exhausting, futile struggle for control. It's understanding that when you face uncertainty, despair, or fear, you ask the God of your understanding to help me be a more willing partner. This acknowledges a fundamental limit to individual effort and opens the door to receiving help from a greater external source. It moves you beyond that isolated internal battle Peabody focused on.
Then comes the spiritual awakening, which sounds like a profoundly transformative experience. It's described as a new state of consciousness and being. Can you describe what that might feel like or how it actually shows up in someone's life?
It is often profound, yes, but it's important to understand it's not always some dramatic, instantaneous lightning bolt, like those hot flash conversions Silkworth mentioned. While some people might experience a sudden cathartic shift, for many, a spiritual awakening is described as a more gradual yet pervasive new state of consciousness and being. It often manifests simply as a sense of well-being, a feeling of peace that was completely absent before. An internal quietness, a calm that settles over the inner chaos. It can feel like an inner revolution where one's whole attitude toward life underwent a silent revolution. Old worries start to diminish, a new grounded confidence grows, and ideas that once seemed like empty platitudes, things like this too shall pass or live and let live, suddenly resonate with deep personal meaning and practical truth. It's a fundamental shift in perception, in your emotional landscape, in your entire relationship with the world around you.
So it really transforms suffering, gives it meaning, and offers this new sense of clarity and purpose.
Exactly. AA is described as no success story in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a story of suffering transmuted under grace into spiritual progress. The immense suffering caused by alcoholism isn't just wasted pain, it becomes the very fuel for a deeper spiritual evolution. This awakening can bring a calm inner knowing, a feeling of rightness when you feel aligned with your higher power. It leads to a clarity and purpose that were previously unimaginable in the fog of drinking. Living God's will in this context stops being a rigid religious command and becomes simply the only way, a guiding principle that brings a sense of meaning, direction, and profound inner peace. Through this conscious contact with a higher power, intuition and inspiration are possible, suggesting access to a new wellspring of guidance and insight that goes beyond just intellect or logical deduction.
So prayer in AA isn't just about asking for stuff. It's framed as an action that actually changes you at a fundamental character level.
That's a key AA idea, yes, and it really underscores the active nature of the spiritual program. Prayer, in this context, is seen as the only real action, because prayer is the only thing that changes one's character. It's not just seen as a ritualistic plea, it's viewed as a transformative practice, a consistent effort to connect, reflect, seek guidance that, over time, subtly but profoundly rewires your inner landscape. This consistent conscious effort makes one a different person, capable of responding to life's challenges in new, healthier, more constructive ways. The change isn't forced or willed in the old sense. It's cultivated through this ongoing spiritual practice, leading to a new set of values and reactions.
And this all culminates in the immense importance of action, particularly carrying the message to others. It's definitely not a passive program, is it? Just sitting around thinking spiritual thoughts.
Not at all. Far from it. In fact, the theme of the 12th step, which is the culmination of the program, is the joy of living, and its key word is action. This action involves giving that asks no reward, love that has no price tag. AA is emphatically described as more than a set of principles. It is a society of alcoholics in action. This concept emphasizes that sobriety isn't a solitary achievement you just hoard for yourself. It's seen as a precious gift that must be shared to be kept. As the Big Book famously states, we must carry the message, else we ourselves can wither. This means that actively helping another struggling alcoholic isn't merely altruistic. It's considered absolutely integral to maintaining one's own sustained recovery.
Wow. So helping others isn't just a nice thing to do if you feel like it. It's actually vital, a life-sustaining practice for the recovering alcoholic in this model.
Absolutely. For many, actively helping other alcoholics provides a profound purpose in life, a new lease on life. It becomes a tangible way to do something worthwhile with the suffering they themselves endured. The strength and resilience of AA lie in this mutual sharing, in alcoholics sharing their suffering and the step taken to gain and maintain recovery with newcomers who are still suffering. It's that explicit, almost paradoxical statement, I can't keep it unless I give it away. This creates a powerful reciprocal relationship where giving back strengthens your own sobriety. It fosters a deep sense of community, responsibility, and meaning that was often entirely absent during the drinking years. It's a powerful self-perpetuating cycle of healing and service.
What a journey. We spent some real time now meticulously charting Richard Peabody's blueprint for self-mastery, a rigorous, almost academic approach to reclaiming the mind from alcohol's grip. His vision, rooted in intellectual control and re-education, was genuinely groundbreaking for its time, challenging that prevailing notion of alcoholism as just a moral failing.
And then we saw how Alcoholics Anonymous, popping up just a few years later in 1935, offered a dramatically different path, one rooted not in self-will, but in spiritual transformation. Acknowledging powerlessness, fostering humility, encouraging surrender to a higher power, and building this crucial foundation of mutual aid and fellowship. It was a complete paradigm shift, really, moving the focus of change from individual intellectual effort to spiritual connection and collective action.
Okay, so we've laid out Peabody's meticulous, self-reliant re-education and AA's transformative, spiritually rooted solution. Now, let's really zero in on the profound difference between these two approaches. It's like looking at two completely different maps trying to get to the same place, each using a radically different compass.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah. Peabody's model fundamentally positions the self as the solution. He emphasized the individual's intelligent self, their inherent stubbornness, even as resources you could redirect from destructive to constructive ends. The whole therapeutic process, in his view, relied on intellectual understanding, that rational self-talk, and conscious, persistent effort to reconstruct mental processes. The problem of alcoholism was framed as an ingrained habit, a faulty way of thinking that could be corrected through rigorous, almost academic self-discipline. The cure was a direct result of the individual's diligent work on themselves, like mastering any complex subject. The power was seen as residing within the person, needing to be found, cultivated, and rigorously applied. It was a very human-centered, rational approach to problem solving.
So the individual was the primary agent of change, armed with their own intellect and will, essentially pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, mentally speaking.
Precisely. They were the architect of their own recovery. But AA, on the other hand, makes an almost completely opposite assertion. The self is not the solution, but rather the self, especially the self-will, is the core of the problem, and a higher power is the ultimate solution. This is where the profound inversion happens. AA posits that the alcoholic self, particularly their self-will, that very stubbornness Peabody wanted to harness, is actually at the root of the difficulty. As their literature states, our great need is loss of self-centeredness and alcoholic obsession. So instead of intellectual control, AA starts by acknowledging profound powerlessness over alcohol and the consistent failure of willpower alone. The solution, therefore, isn't self-mastery, but submission to God, a turning over our will and lives to the care of God as we understood him. The change comes not primarily from diligent intellectual work, but through a spiritual awakening, which is often described as being received like a free gift through practicing the steps.
That's a huge so what right there, isn't it? It's a complete, almost existential shift in where the agency for change actually lies. It's not just tweaking the method, it's totally redefining the entire recovery process, who's in charge.
It is absolutely immense. Think about the sheer audacity of it back then. For centuries, Western philosophy often glorified self-mastery, autonomy, the power of the individual will. Peabody really embodied that intellectual tradition. Then AA comes along just a few years later and essentially says, well, actually, for the real alcoholic, your greatest supposed strength, your ego, your self-will, is your biggest enemy. It's what leads you back to the bottle every single time. Wow. That's not just a philosophical pivot. It's a gut-wrenching, yet often profoundly liberating revelation for someone who has tried everything else based on willpower and failed repeatedly. It completely redefines what strength even means in recovery, shifting it from internal resolve to external reliance or maybe collaboration with something external. It's moving from, I can fix myself to, I cannot fix myself alone. I need help from something greater than myself.
This really makes AA's approach truly radical, especially when we compare the specifics point by point, like the very source of strength. Peabody urged finding it internally, but AA explicitly asks for external reliance.
Absolutely. Peabody encouraged the individual to find and harness their own best self, their intelligent will, to beat addiction. He believed the power resided within. Conversely, AA asks individuals to first acknowledge their self's profound limitations and then seek help from an external higher power. This means shifting reliance away from internal resources, the ego, the intellect, the will, towards a conscious dependence on a spiritual force, however they define it. It acknowledges that human effort alone is insufficient for this particular problem. It's a fundamental reorientation of where you draw your power from.
And the method of change itself is fundamentally different too, from intellectual correction, like that course of study analogy, to a process involving spiritual grace and transformation.
Yes. Peabody's re-education is essentially a mental and behavioral training program, a rigorous course designed to correct faulty thinking and instill new habits through conscious effort. AA, however, offers suffering transmuted under grace into spiritual progress and the possibility of a new kinship with God. It's not primarily about learning to think differently, although that happens. It's more about being fundamentally changed from the inside out through a spiritual process that seems to transcend mere intellect or logical reasoning. The change feels deeper than just cognitive reframing. It's often described as a shift in one's very being, a change in consciousness.
So Peabody was maybe looking more to manage the symptoms and the ingrained habits, but AA seems to aim for a much deeper change in who you are, a true metamorphosis.
That's precisely right. While Peabody aimed to free the mind from alcoholic doubts and conflicts and ultimately change the habit of drinking through conscious self-discipline, AA's goal is arguably more fundamental, more existential. It's to become a different person with a new sense of values and a life that is transformed and improved overall. AA explicitly aims to address the twisted system of beliefs brought on by trauma and shame that they believe forms the unconscious program for living underneath the drinking, rather than just focusing on the outward symptom of drinking itself. It's not just about stopping drinking, it's about changing why you drank and fundamentally who you are becoming.
And finally, a really key distinction, one that speaks volumes about the human condition itself maybe, is the social aspect. Alcoholism is often called a lonely business, and Peabody's approach, with its intense focus on self-mastery, seems to almost reflect that isolation, whereas AA offers this profound communal fellowship.
Indeed. Although Peabody's method could certainly involve external guidance from a therapist or a doctor, the heavy emphasis was squarely on the individual's solitary work, that internal struggle, the self-talk, the planning. And the experience of active alcoholism itself, as our sources vividly describe, is often a deeply lonely business, where self-will tends to drive people away and isolate the sufferer further and further. AA, in stark contrast, makes mutual sharing, sponsorship, one alcoholic guiding another, and being part of a society of alcoholics in action absolutely critical components of recovery. This communal aspect directly addresses the profound isolation inherent in addiction. It offers a network of understanding, identification, and unconditional support that becomes a vital lifeline for many, something largely absent from Peabody's intensely individualistic framework. It taps into the profound healing power of one suffering human connecting honestly with another.
What a fascinating comparison. So let's wrap this up. We've journeyed back to 1931, really dug into Richard Peabody's groundbreaking yet ultimately self-reliant psychological approach to alcoholism. His work was this systematic attempt to address a problem often dismissed as just moral weakness, emphasizing intellectual control, re-education, a kind of rigorous self-mastery.
And then we saw how Alcoholics Anonymous, emerging just a few short years later, offered such a dramatically different path. one rooted fundamentally in spiritual transformation, acknowledging powerlessness, fostering humility, encouraging surrender to a higher power, however understood, and building this crucial foundation of mutual aid and shared experience. It was a complete paradigm shift, really, moving the locus of change from individual will and intellect to spiritual connection and collective action.
Peabody's work, no doubt, represented a significant step forward. It recognized alcoholism as a condition that could potentially be addressed through psychological intervention. He offered a structured method when there was mostly just chaos and judgment. But AA's revolutionary spiritual solution, with its emphasis on powerlessness, humility, and reliance on a higher power, opened up a completely different path. One that seemed to transcend purely human efforts and continues to resonate profoundly with millions today, offering a new vision of what recovery could look like.
It really highlights a core philosophical tension that, frankly, continues to challenge us today in many fields, not just addiction. Is true and lasting change primarily about what we can do for ourselves, through our own willpower, our intellect, our effort? Or is it fundamentally about what we can receive, what can happen when we let go of that fierce self-reliance and connect to something larger than ourselves, whether that's a community, a spiritual force, or universal principles?
And that leads perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Considering all the ongoing debates about addiction treatment today, from medical interventions and behavioral therapies to holistic wellness approaches and peer support models, where do you think the balance lies? What's the interplay between the power of individual will and effort and the potentially profound impact of spiritual transformation, or maybe just profound connection in overcoming life's deepest challenges? How much of true sustainable change is ultimately self-made, and how much might be received or co-created? Something to think about.